Module 1. This is Mr. Buford, and we're going to talk about the brain. You go, boy. Come on. All right. Hey, guys. Welcome to Module 1. Right before we left, we had just finished our brain dissection, so we've talked about the anatomy of the brain and a little bit about the histology as well. So we talked about the neurons and the neuroglia, the supporting cells of the brain. Because of our predicament now, I'm going to mostly cover content in lecture format, and then your assignments are going to be a little more research-based to kind of give you some real-world application versus just question and answer type deal. So, that being said, today, since we've already gone over brain anatomy, we're going to talk about a little more anatomy regarding brain protection or CNS protection, and then injury, not disease, injury. You're going to be doing some research on disease. So let's get into it. Make sure that you have your notes available. I've made a Word document for your notes outline, as well as a fillable PDF, and then your PowerPoint is available in PowerPoint format as well as PDF in case you don't have the Microsoft Office applications. If you have any issues accessing anything, just let me know and we'll figure it out. Your assignment for this week will be due on the 20th, or not this week, but this module. So that'll be Monday, any time of day. So I think It's Learning sets the deadline to be 11:59 p.m., which I hope it wouldn't be that late. But you have up until that point. It is available to you, so you're welcome to complete that at your own pace. So let's go through our slides and just take notes as we go. All right, so when it comes to layers of protection, obviously the brain and spinal cord, very important. It's our command center, and we need to protect it as best we can. First layer of defense, or the external layer, is going to be your skin. We refer to the skin that's on our head as our scalp. And surrounding the organs, we have the skull and vertebral column. So we do have a layer of bone. And if you look at this diagram here, we talked briefly in the skeletal unit about periosteum, the layer surrounding the bone. So of course your skull and your vertebral column, they have periosteum surrounding the bone layer, the osteum. And then in your CNS, or central nervous system, you also have the meninges. Now, you'll probably remember this from when we had to remove the meninges off of the sheep brain. It felt kind of papery-ish. And we have that as well. There's 3 layers that make up the meninges. The outer layer is called the dura mater. It's spelled mater, M-A-T-E-R, but it is pronounced matter. The dura mater is the outermost layer. We then have the arachnoid and the pia mater. We're going to get to those in just a second. In addition to the meninges, we have cerebrospinal fluid, sometimes abbreviated as CSF. And then we are going to briefly talk about the blood-brain barrier. So let's dive into that. I'm not talking about the scalp and skin, not talking about the skull or vertebral column, because we've already had our integumentary unit and we've already had our skeletal unit. So I want to get into the protective measures that we haven't got much background on. When it comes to the meninges, like I said, we've got these 3 layers. The outermost external layer is the dura mater, and it's a doubled layer. Just below that, we have the arachnoid. The arachnoid has all these little fibrous web-like structures, and that's where it gets its name arachnoid. Think about, a spider being an arachnid who spins a web. We have the arachnoid, which is web-like. Now, I know I didn't include this in your notes, but I do think it's worth mentioning. If you look at this arachnoid layer, hopefully you can see my mouse. We're looking at this tan layer, and we have all these tan web-like structures. But what's not mentioned is the space in between all of those features. That's called the subarachnoid. The subarachnoid space is important because you're going to have fluid circulation through there of CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, and it might also be a place where there's blood collection if there's injuries such as hemorrhage or contusion. Finally, we have the pia mater. The pia mater is the most internal layer, and this clings to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. So this is the layer that we cut through to get to the brain because it kind of was stuck to it, kind of attached to it. And the entire area of the brain and spinal cord are going to be enclosed in this for protective measures. I believe before we did our dissections, I mentioned to you that if there's an infection in this region, in any of these layers, that's meningitis. Itis being inflammation of the meninges. So you probably have been familiar with that or are familiar with that. Cerebrospinal fluid is a watery substance that is made in the choroid plexus. You have more than one plexus. There's a main area in the epithalamus that produces cerebrospinal fluid. You also have a plexus in what's called the fourth ventricle, which is a storage region near the brainstem that produces cerebrospinal fluid. And I like to kind of think of this as the filter of a fish tank. If you have water that's stagnant, it makes it very easy for bacteria to collect and to thrive. Whereas if you have movement of that water and it's being filtered, it's less likely for bacteria to gain control of that area or in order to thrive in that area. Same exact thing with your brain. You have this fluid that's constantly being circulated to prevent it becoming stagnant, to prevent the environment from becoming stagnant and allowing bacteria to thrive. And so this fluid is going to be sent all throughout. It's going to be sent through the subarachnoid, or what we call the arachnoid space, through the ventricles, which I have given you a diagram of in your notes, as well as the central canal of your spinal cord. It is possible to have an overabundance of cerebrospinal fluid, and when that happens, somebody typically needs to have a spinal tap, and they will drain the fluid if there's excess. And then in special cases, so for example, my mom has a condition called pseudotumor cerebri, where her brain acted, or I guess acts, as if there's a tumor that doesn't exist. So it produces more cerebrospinal fluid than is needed. And so the neurosurgeons decided to insert a shunt going from her head and back into her lymphatic system to help reduce that amount of excess cerebrospinal fluid. Interesting stuff. All right. So here is our circulation image. As you can see, we've got arrows going all over. Right where my mouse is, right here, this is our fourth ventricle. We have a choroid plexus here. So choroid plexus, the fourth ventricle, that's going to be a producer of CSF. And then if you look right here at the epithalamus, kind of in the lateral ventricles here, we have another choroid plexus that's going to be producing cerebrospinal fluid. This watery substance is going to serve as a cushion for your brain. Your brain kind of is just floating, suspended in this cerebrospinal fluid. All right. Another one that I want to chat with you about is the blood-brain barrier. I think this is the final feature that I want to talk to you about. The blood-brain barrier is essentially the system of capillaries in your brain that are the least permeable in your entire body. And what that means is that there's not a lot of substances that are able to get through these capillaries to get into the tissues of your brain. It's not allowed to leave the blood supply. This is major for us because that means that there's a lot of harmful substances that are not going to be allowed to enter the brain because that barrier prevents the passage of those substances. There's plenty, though, that can still pass. Some are beneficial, some not so beneficial, which I apparently did not include here. But just to give you a list, oxygen and carbon dioxide, in other words, your respiratory gases, are able to pass through the blood-brain barrier. Carbon monoxide, which is not so good, is able to pass through the blood-brain barrier. Hang on, I'm trying to come up. Nicotine, alcohol. Alcohol can pass through the blood-brain barrier. And then some types of fats are able to as well. Now, while the blood-brain barrier is beneficial to us to help prevent from the majority of toxins, although alcohol and nicotine are still able to pass through, and anesthesia can pass through as well, there are substances that we would like to pass through the blood-brain barrier but are unable to, and unfortunately are making, cures for certain disorders to be very difficult. So for example, when you're looking at conditions such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, they know what neurotransmitters are needed in order to restore function for that individual. So if somebody's diagnosed with Parkinson's, why not just give them a dose of whatever that neurotransmitter is? And while that would be fantastic, unfortunately, it's impermeable to the blood-brain barrier. So there are many different possibilities for cures that we simply can't use because the blood-brain barrier prevents its passage. You're also going to be looking more into this when you do your assignment. Let's talk about some injuries now. Concussions are going to be a mild form of traumatic brain injury. This has to do with the shaking, twisting of the brain, whether it is a direct blow to the head or if the hit is great enough to the body that it transfers to the head. This typically, if this is a one-time deal, does not result in brain damage, permanent brain damage. However, if somebody has consecutive untreated, it definitely can lead to brain damage. So that's why concussion testing is so important. If you are going into the sports med field, you will definitely need to be familiar with concussion testing because you're going to need to monitor your athletes, and um, on-field testing will then help you determine if your player needs to have additional medical treatment. That's concussion. A contusion, on the other hand, is when it's more forceful of a blow that there is going to be destruction of nervous tissue. Um, because of this destruction, there's most likely going to be brain damage because nervous tissue does not regenerate. Essentially, you're born with all of the neurons that you're going to have. Um, this is why stem cell research is so big, because they're trying to see if there is potential to have regeneration of nervous tissues, because as of right now, our regeneration of nervous damage is very minimal. Cerebral edema is an inflammatory response. This is really strong when it comes to excess cerebrospinal fluid. The problem, though, is yes, you want the circulation, but you're bringing in too much fluid into the brain, and it's going to cause compression between the brain and the skull. And if you're pushing on that tissue, it's going to cause death in that tissue that's being compressed upon. When you did your brain dissection, you could even feel just how fragile and kind of spongy the brain is. And ours are the exact same way. If we have fluid trapped between the skull and the brain, it's going to push on the brain. It's going to apply a lot of pressure, and it can cause cell death. This is one reason that you might hear about induced comas, to help prevent additional inflammatory response, and spinal taps to help relieve fluid buildup. Okay. Finally, cerebrovascular accidents. In other words, a stroke or a hemorrhage. These are interchangeable terms. A blood hemorrhage is when a vessel supplying some region of the brain ruptures. This could happen at an aneurysm site. An aneurysm is when there's a weakening of the wall of the vessel. And because that blood supply has ruptured, the brain tissue in that region is going to die because it's no longer going to get oxygen. And depending on the supply that's been cut off, it can lead to different loss of functions for that person, or it could also result in death. It honestly just depends on where the hemorrhage is and how much brain tissue has been deprived of oxygen. Now, last little bit here, I've given you the warning signs and symptoms of stroke. Of course, this is not always how it goes, but typically there will be drooping of the face, and if the hemorrhage is on one side of the brain, it's likely to affect the opposite motor side. Arm weakness is a symptom. The individual might be able to raise one arm but not the other. Speech difficulty, whether it's slurring, jumbling of words that don't make sense. If you see these in someone, that's the sign to call 911 right away, because reaction time can really be a big difference on whether or not somebody not only survives, but what the long-term injuries from a stroke are, right? finally, let's get to our assignment for this week. So you're going to be researching 3 different disorders. Your first condition, I want you to look up a condition related to the blood-brain barrier. You have a couple of options here. You can look at a condition caused by damage to the blood-brain barrier, or you can look at something that, a condition that cannot be, cured or treated because of the blood-brain barrier. So I already gave you the example of Parkinson's, so that's off the table. But there's other scenarios where the blood-brain barrier is kind of making treatment options difficult. I want you to look into a condition associated with cerebrospinal fluid, whether it's an excess of or lack of, or even just inflammatory response with cerebrospinal fluid. And then third, I want you to find conditions associated with untreated concussions. Now in our athletics, concussion testing is much higher on the priority list. Unfortunately, even just 10 years ago, concussion testing was not a big deal in athletics, and a lot of times, coaches were they weren't taught, to really look out for the signs and symptoms of concussion in their players. And so there were individuals who would not only have an undiagnosed concussion, but go back out on the field and be subjected to an additional concussion, which can cause long-term damage. For each condition that you're researching, I want 1 to 2 paragraphs with your sources, and this is all to be submitted on It's Learning, again, on April 20th at any time. So if you have any questions in the meantime, let me know. We will have our optional discussion on Friday at noon. So if you have any questions about this, or if you want to know any more about CNS protections or any of the TBIs I talked to you guys about, or even if in your research you come up with more questions, just jot them down so you can bring them up during our class discussion. Thanks, guys.